All right, welcome to Caffeinated. I am Charlie with you as always. Today is a very, very special episode for me in particular. We have discovered who invented the pyramids. And no, not the Egyptians or even the aliens, as I have always kind of assumed. I don't know if you agree with me there, Eric. It's reasonable. But we have Dr. Eric Helms here. He already knows I am honored to be speaking with him. I'm excited. Dr. Helms, if you don't know who he is, you will. He is the founder and chief science officer for Team 3D Muscle Journey. You want to get over to their YouTube right now. You want to check it out, subscribe. It is incredibly informative, and you'll also have the pleasure of looking at this buff dude. You are the founder of MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport Research Review, which I strive to understand every month, and I'm learning this stuff. You have a podcast called Iron Culture, which is absolutely terrific. I love it. You and Omar are great on it. The last episode I listened to was, I'm a couple behind. You were doing one about water and weight loss assumptions, which I thought was really, really on the nose. Awesome. Guys should check that out in the audience. You're a strength and conditioning research fellow in New Zealand and Auckland University of Technology. And aside from the PhD, you're, of course, pro natural bodybuilder. I know I'm a little late to the party. Congrats on becoming a pro, Eric.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I appreciate
that's incredible. We're going to get into that, I'm sure. And lastly, you are the author of these two gems right here, the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, both training and nutrition. I have right here. I love these books. These books have helped shape my philosophy, not just on training and nutrition, which is obvious. I highly recommend these books. What I love about them so much, which I want to talk about later, is this is not just bodybuilding nutrition, how to eat, to hit the macros, to get the protein in, to lift. There is so much health and wellness in here, from the mental aspects to tracking food to using the scale, and kind of how, micronutrients, even how important that is, making sure those vitamins are in there when you could be focused on those other things. It's fantastic. Highly recommend it. I have the second editions here, but am I correct? The third editions are coming out soon?
Yeah, I'm working my way through them currently. They should be getting finished before the end of the year.
I'm going to find a way to get an autographed copy. I know I'm going to be like, hey, come on. Check out those books, guys, right now. And first off, thank you so much for being here with us today. I've never convinced another human being to have a conversation with me, so this is like a new experience for both of us. Well, thank you. I figured it out. Welcome to the show, sir.
My pleasure. That was a very, very generous introduction. And only thing I would say is I am a co-founder of 3DMJ and MASS. Just got to give all the shout outs to the people who
Understood.
I work with. Yeah.
All right. I don't want to get you in hot water. Co-founder. Still pretty awesome. Before I get into all the things I'm super curious to ask you, what the heck are you up to lately? What's new and exciting in your world?
The big thing for me, you said you were late to the party with congratulating me on my my pro card win in the WNBF, but that's something I've been trying to achieve since I became aware of it in like 2005. So 19 years in the making, 18 years when I did it, and it's still very much top of mind for me. I'm very much enjoying kind of this, I guess you could say, relatively late career phase where I'm kind of getting back to my roots, if you will, of being a bodybuilder first, because before I was a personal trainer, before I was a student, researcher, author, any of the things that I do today, I was just a really, really excited, bit by the iron bug, kind of iron disciple dude. And that hasn't really changed. I just do a lot of other stuff related to it. And now it's really exciting to kind of focus in on trying to do my first proper pro season. Because while I did get an opportunity to compete as a pro in 2023, it was at Worlds for my first show, which is a highly competitive place to go. And the first year you turn pro, you can compete without having to qualify. So now I'm having my first proper professional off season. And I've just been like very, very focused and dialed in on that. Not to the exclusion of anything else, but that's kind of what's top of mind.
So this is a unique opportunity. You can speak to people who are pro, who aren't pro. You can't always get to talk to people who just turn pro. So in comparison, is this a more stressful off season? Because now you have hit this mark and now where do you go? Or is it just like, yeah, I did it and I know how I got here?
I think it is actually a lot less stressful because I wasn't necessarily sure in my heart of hearts that I would ever turn pro in the WNBF. I think sometime when I didn't really understand how competitive it was in the mid 2000s when I very first started competing in my like 20s, I had some rosy-eyed, probably overly optimistic glasses, but those maybe became slightly pessimistic glasses. And now that I have turned pro, I've achieved something that I questioned whether I was even capable of. So to me, it kind of feels like everything's extra credit at this point, but not to the point where I'm resting on my laurels. I'm also like very, very motivated to see what is my potential and what can I achieve. So I've put more effort into bodybuilding now and more planning and crossed more I's and more T's, but I found it very easy because I'm passionate about it. It's fun. And there isn't any kind of, and we could even talk about the research on perfectionist concerns versus perfectionist striving if you wanted to. But there's no
Absolutely.
like fear of failure or negative pressure to do so. It is me trying to reach for the stars, and if I hit the moon, I'm already past the atmosphere that I never thought I'd get to, kind of deal.
Yeah, you were talking in an interview not too long ago, forgive me, I don't remember with who, but you were kind of saying, I remember that you for so long were kind of disassociating from the outcome, and it was you versus you. And then it was something with the judging or whatnot, something like that, and you felt yourself have that like reaction where you felt competitive, and then you're like, okay, maybe I am competitive in this thing. I mean, is that something you've kind of come to embrace a little bit?
Yeah, so in 2019, I was very, very, very close to turning pro. And it was the first year where I had gone, you know what, let's make this an outcome. Let's make this, we'll try for this. But I hadn't fully embraced it. And then in 2023, and actually the incident you're talking about was actually 2019, there was one show where I actually had the opportunity to turn pro. The two shows prior to that ended up not having enough competitors in them. And in that 2019 show, I didn't place the way I wanted to in the middleweights. And it was a bit of an unexpected gut punch. And I realized that it was because I was focused more on the outcome. And like you said, I had primarily focused on just progressing, making progress and going, if I progress, then I'm becoming more competitive. Let's just focus on myself. That's more facilitative. But I think in some ways, there are positives to be gleaned from focusing on the external outcome, but I see that kind of as an extrinsic motivator that can support a strong intrinsic motivation. And I think sometimes people focus on the extrinsic when they don't have a strong sense of intrinsic drive, and that can be risky. And I felt the cost of it in that moment. I was like, oh, I put a lot of chips into, like emotional chips proverbially, into the outcome. And despite the fact that this is my best showing ever, literally best physique I've ever had on stage, one of my first reactions was negative. And I had to ruminate on that. Is that worth it? Am I okay with that? And then 2023, I really got to bask in that because I entered the season and I was like, the goal this season, of course, is to be my best, to compete, to enjoy the process, to make it something that enhances my life, and to integrate all that good stuff that has never changed and has been a part of me since the start and is part of the ethos of 3D Muscle Journey. But I'm also here to win. And I'm going to treat this like I'm a competitor. I'm deserving of winning, and it is a goal. I'm going to speak it out into the world, and it's going to be something I focus on. And it definitely made that season feel different. It reminded me a bit of 2009, back when I was kind of gunning for that as well, where there was pressure to each show, you know, and I was nervous to a degree that I hadn't been previously. And I did have to, again, assess, is that worth it? And the answer was essentially yes, now that I have kind of the maturity, the time in sport, and the knowledge that I am going to be doing this thing for intrinsic reasons no matter what. But I can also decide to strive for some competitive outcomes and be okay with basically giving up some power, because I think that's essentially what you're doing, especially in a subjective sport like this. It's not like powerlifting, where if I'm hitting PRs in training, well, there's a pretty good chance on game day I will be able to hit a new total. And the judges are there to validate it. And occasionally you might be like, I don't agree with that squat depth call, but in bodybuilding, it's way more subjective than that. and you're essentially going, all right, I don't know who's going to show up, because I could be at my best physique and some killers show up and I place third, which actually happened to me in one of the shows in 2023. Or I could be actually not that good. I could have had a rough season, and I just don't have a very competitive field, and I get placed higher than would be indicated, or what I expected. So it's a very different thing. And I guess the take home is that I feel I have the maturity now to focus on being competitive. Now, that probably only mattered last year in 2023 because while I did win a show and I won a pro card and I placed second to a pro winner, I had a very, very good competitive season as an amateur. But then when I went to Worlds and competed as a pro middleweight, I placed 7th out of 9th, which is awesome on the world stage, don't get me wrong.
Absolutely.
And just, being there was a huge privilege.
And your conditioning was fantastic, by the way, just for anyone who hasn't seen. I mean, it's really...
Thank you.
I mean,
I really appreciate that.
One of the things that you have said that I love and I can absolutely resonate with is there's an intrinsic motivation where if it's not there, it just doesn't matter. I mean, I'm relating to acting as an actor and being involved in the arts and things like that. You're at the... If it's a casting director, whatever it is, like we want a condition, we want an outcome, we want to bring it, but someone's deciding whether or not you're right for a role. And I think, being competitive is fantastic, and if it just adds that fuel to the fire. But at the end of the day, intrinsically, if you don't feel that passion that you clearly feel, especially what I imagine, I have never done a show before, I've never gone through what you've gone through, to go down to those single digits where you go, you have to want that.
I remember watching some of the documentaries or reading about certain athletes, like I want to say it's Andre Agassi, who hated tennis but played it his whole life because his parents.
I didn't know that.
I could now. Again, I only know about one thing, but
it was either him or Sampras for sure because they played each other like 50 times.
I think it was Agassi, but I want to say that he hated tennis, but he was pushed into doing it a ton. And I know there are similar stories out there for other athletes, and it gets kind of baked into their identity and just their environment and the who they are in the kind of the process of growing up by overzealous parents. But bodybuilding and strength sport in general is not like that. Like outside of very rare instances, you are an adult and you decide to do this because you're a fitness enthusiast, right? There are some notable exceptions in other countries where Olympic lifting is kind of baked into like university sport, or in Texas, they have Texas powerlifting is huge at the high school level. So you can be 14 and be on a powerlifting team. So it can be a little different, but in most cases, you meet somebody who says, I'm a bodybuilder, sometime in their 20s after they've been lifting for a while, or maybe they were into strength and conditioning and got hurt or couldn't take football any higher or whatever. They go, I would like to do this really weird thing of putting on a Speedo and flexing on stage. Or I found a powerlifting club, or I found a weightlifting club. So I think in the kind of the strength sport realm, once someone actually decides to compete, you could almost guarantee, unless it's just a bucket list one-time thing, which happens a lot with bodybuilding, kind of the transformation vehicle. But for people who compete multiple times, they almost invariably have a strong passion for some component for it, or they simply are not able to motivate them through what they have to do, especially in bodybuilding, like you said, because it's quite grueling.
I mean, it's such a unique sport. One of the things I wanted to ask you, and I'm really always so curious about, is you're a natural bodybuilder, and you have such dedication. What made you say, you know what, I'm staying in this natural space, I'm not going to be an enhanced guy? Enhanced means steroids for friends at home. I don't know what it is. And again, no judgment whatsoever, but for you to stay in that lane, it's so intriguing to me because you have to have all of that dedication. I don't want to get myself in trouble and say, more or less than a pro, but in the enhanced world, but how did you stay in that lane? Was it a health and wellness choice, or how did that happen for you?
It's a good question. And I think the first thing I will say is that the decision to use anabolics outside of bodybuilding is actually quite different than the decision to either decide to use it in bodybuilding and go the enhanced tested or untested route. The reason I say that is that most people who want to develop a certain physique, they're kind of like, why not use steroids? And then they decide based upon the health and wellness component. And that is often their principal concern, or more often, depending upon the country they're in, the legality of it and the financial risk. And the fact that there's an interaction between the two. Like if it's illegal where you're at, you're probably getting it illicitly, and you should have very little confidence in what you're actually purchasing being what it actually is. And in fact, there has been research on this where a shockingly high proportion of a certain type of anabolics is actually something else.
Yeah.
So you're literally playing with your health, even if you are doing it in a responsible way, because you go, oh, I've got the dosages right, I've got the doctor looking at my blood work, but yeah, that's not actually what you think you're putting in your body. And by the way, it wasn't done to pharmaceutical standards; it was made in a bathtub, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So,
basement.
Yeah, so that decision, I think we need to take a look at it. Okay, cool, that's what people might be doing outside of a competitive context. But in bodybuilding, and you could even argue, okay, look, I can see two guys who are gym rats, neither one competes, similar physique, we can assume average genetics. The guy on gear has an easier time. You could argue it's a shortcut, but who cares? They're not competing. They want to achieve an outcome.
Right.
Why wouldn't I do this? That's their choice. That's probably how they see it. I don't actually think it's easier to achieve a high-level enhanced physique in competitive bodybuilding than a high-level natural physique. And in fact, you might be able to argue it takes more, maybe not dedication, but at least sacrifice, because it's a whole nother variable that you're now managing. While WNBF Worlds is highly competitive, and I placed 7th out of 9th in my class, that wouldn't translate to placing 7th at the Olympia if I was enhanced.
Yeah.
I would probably be maybe middle of the pack. If, let's say I was taking all the enhancements in the world, just from what I know of being involved in the sport for over 20 years, I think I would be a bottom tier IFBB pro, right? Not a 7th place Mr. Olympia person. Because if you're top 10 in the Olympia and the IFBB, you're one of the best bodybuilders in the world. So I want to just make that distinction clear. But let's say I was on all this stuff and I was doing everything that an IFBB pro who's trying to get as high as a placing as they could in the Olympia, I'd probably be competing at like 250 pounds, you know?
I mean, at your height?
Yeah, right?
You're a tall
so
dude.
That's a 75-pound difference that we're talking about. So when you think about the polypharmacy that requires, the health risks that you're dealing with from that, the changes in your mental health state, which I think Mike Israell has done a great job talking about.
First of all, you did a fantastic interview with him a couple of months ago. One of the things with Mike Israell, like you kind of said, is he's so transparent about it, whereas you don't see that all the time.
Mike Israell does a great job of being very agnostic about the choice, not moralizing it, but also making sure people have informed consent around the decision to stay natural or not. So as a competitor, when you decide, do I want to go enhanced or not, I think there's a lot of things that go into it. Some people decide or think they decide, but it really has much more to do with their environment. And when I first got into bodybuilding, natural bodybuilding was not as well known. It hadn't been, popularized on the internet. The first person to do that for me was actually like Lane Norton, who at the time, before he was known as a power lifter and before he was Dr. Lane Norton, but actually still doing his PhD, I knew him as Straight Flexed on the bodybuilding.com forums.
Wow.
That was his handle.
Wow.
And he was doing his PhD, competing in natural bodybuilding, and he had a series called Inside the Life of a Natural Pro. And I think he turned pro in the mid-2000s, right around the time I started paying attention to the sport of bodybuilding. But for me, my first exposure to bodybuilding was, Ronnie Coleman, Jake Cutler, that era.
I'm your age, me too.
Yeah, so I literally did not know about natural bodybuilding until I got exposed to it. So someone who was considering competing, I was starting to go down the pathway of, how do I rationalize this? Because I didn't really know there was another avenue. And I remember watching the HBO Real Sports documentary where like the folks from Muscular Development, like John Romano at the time, were like, where are the bodies? And I was like, yeah, where are the bodies? There's no risks to this stuff. It's just, receding hairlines, some acne, it'll be fine. Not realizing that, low dose TRT is not the same thing as, spending $4,000 on gear every month.
Yeah,
and
that's financial.
So I was going down that pathway because I was interested in competing, and I was trying to feel out whether I wanted to do that. And once I finally did get exposed to natural bodybuilding, and I went, oh, there's a way for me to go and create a competitive landscape that doesn't require that. I was interested. I wanted to look into it more. And I found that for me, knowing myself, that I become quite obsessive about whatever I do. I get very passionate, and I put all of my energy into the one thing that I'm super excited about. I knew that if I was training as effectively as I thought I could, if I was following my nutrition as effectively as I thought I could, but I wasn't getting to the competitive outlet or level that I wanted, the thing that you can always do more of is take more gear.
Such a good point.
I was concerned about my personality interacting with kind of the no-holds-barred polypharmacy chemical warfare that I had seen many people engage in. And there are some examples at local shows. If you ever attend an NPC show, you watch the super heavyweights, guys who've been trying to turn pro for years, and they look big, but they don't look good, and they're probably taking 3 times the gear that your average IFBB pro person is taking at the same body weight, and you're just like, wow, I don't want to be that person. So to me, the choice was related towards putting some guardrails on my personality, and I'm mostly interested in maximizing my potential regardless of the constraints. I don't have a desire to get to 250, 275 pounds, but it's the aesthetic choice is less, like I don't really have a desire to get to 200 pounds like I am now. I was fine with my body. I never felt the need to be like, oh, I'm small, I got to be bigger. So for me, it was more like I really love lifting. I like the process of trying to chip away at this goal that gets increasingly hard, like the climbing of Everest type of deal. And I don't really care if, Everest is boosted up by Anavar or if it's just where it's at for my genetics. But I want to climb it. And then once I made the decision, then it was an easy way to go. Like I was tempted to go the enhanced route early on because I was potentially, that's the only way I knew bodybuilding was. But once I had made the decision to go, the drug-free route, then it was like, okay, easy. What are the banned substance lists? Cool. Do I fit into that? Oh man, I did use pro hormones in 2004. I got to, I just looked at it very objectively. Like, what are the rules? I'll follow them because it's nice to have some constraints.
That's just fascinating because that's the kind of thing that must be so personal for you guys. Everyone looks at it. I remember just seeing Arnold when I was very young. We're about the same age, and I remember watching Pumping Iron, which at that time was still an old movie, but I really enjoyed it. And in the beginning, it's like, how the heck did this guy end up looking like this? And then, like you said, as you learn a little more, you start to maybe set those guardrails for yourself. You also just you touched on I been a fan of Lane Norton for a while as well in terms of fitness influencing, and Mike Israell. One of the things today I find kind of disturbing a little bit is you kind of have this dysmorphia among people, where it's like, on one hand, I think people have looked at these people who are just mass monsters and 6% body fat, like it's the norm. And what like I mentioned earlier, Mike Israell, I love the transparency and him talking about this stuff because I think it helps the cause so much that at least it's educating. Do you think that like fitness influencers have a responsibility to have that? Because some of these guys today, it's just like, I got kids and I go, oh boy, I wouldn't want my kids to see that guy talking right now. That's dangerous,
Yeah, I think your responsibility scales with your reach and your impact. And I don't think people necessarily think in those terms. I think people will often reach the heights of popularity and exposure because they're willing to say controversial things. We actually have research on it now. Saying things that is eye-catching and controversial, independent of whether it is true, will get you to a larger audience. And more often than not, things that surprise people because they're actually not true and they seem counterintuitive are things that are also controversial. So that's why we have so many charlatans and why there's always that kind of sexy draw of the clickbait title or the doctors hate me or the whatever, to try to promote health and wellness stuff and, your Gundries or your, your butter in my coffee or whatever, all of the nonsense that's out there. That's why it explodes. So it seems like people become less concerned about the potential negative impact they have as they grow, but I think it's actually the reverse of cause and effect. The people who are able to grow so quickly and achieve these heights are going to, on average, more often be unconcerned about those things because they got to that height.
It's unfortunate, right?
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to touch on a little bit with you also is, I mean, you've talked about it so much already, but I can't help not mentioning gaintaining a little bit with you because your study, the effect of small and large energy surpluses on strength, muscle, and skin fold thickness in resistance-trained individuals, a parallel group's design. As someone who has kind of main gained for a while, as they call it, or is it, am I saying it wrong? Gaintaining? Gaintaining.
I prefer gaintaining because it's the OG one, but that's just a personal preference.
Gaintaining it is. It definitely gave a lot of hope for people who wanted to gain some muscle without perhaps not optimizing. Could you talk a little bit about it? It's really fascinating what you did.
Yeah, that was a study that we did. It took forever to do because COVID happened in the middle of it, unfortunately, and kind of blew up our study a couple times. But essentially, if we look back at the research on this, was not a clear consensus on what is an appropriate size surplus for well-trained individuals trying to quote-unquote bulk, right? And you'll hear people who will be like, listen, the main reason you're not growing is because you didn't commit to a surplus.
Right.
And other people who are like, every time I do that, I just get fat. And how do you reconcile that? When does one occur? When does the other occur? Why? What's going on? And in different contexts, the reality is they both can be true. So if we look at the history of this research, there was a study by Rosnick done in the early 2000s where they took untrained university young males, gave them a resistance training program designed to put on muscle mass, and they gave 2 out of these 3 groups a 2,000 calorie weight gainer on top of their habitual diet. One group, it was straight maltodextrin, basically sugar water. The other group, it was a mixture of that and whey protein. And the other group said, just follow your habitual diet. And the 2 groups that had this 2,000 calorie weight gainer on top of it, they gained about 7 pounds in 8 weeks, and it was exclusively lean mass.
Wow.
So this makes it seem like, oh shit, bulking is the answer, right?
Right.
Of course, all the bodybuilders are right. But that really seems to be disconnected from the experience of people who are not novice, first-time lifters who are young, university-aged males. There's a study by Garth and colleagues that was done on elite athletes in Norway, and they had dietitians give them a specific plan and gave them even probably an arguably better resistance training program 4 days per week. And again, they're elite athletes. You'd think they'd have the genetics for this, right? And the group that was guided by dietitians to eat more, they ate about 600 calories more on average, put on essentially just every little bit of a higher surplus they were, and the athletes who were following their habitual diet became body fat. So it's
interesting.
So what's going on here?
Right.
So we tried to clarify that, and what we did was we took resistance-trained individuals, men and women, who had a certain strength standard, so a pretty well-trained, true intermediate group, with some people who actually had competed in bodybuilding or strength sport in the sample, some people who were, not nearly that advanced, if you will, and we had them follow a 3-day per week, full-body, hypertrophy-oriented and strength-oriented plan for the squat and bench press, and we had them separated into 3 groups. A small surplus intended to be 5% more than what they needed, and a moderate surplus, 15%. And we measured changes in surface adiposity, so their skin fold thicknesses, and then we measured 3 different muscle sites with ultrasound to see changes in muscle thickness, biceps, triceps, and quads. And then we looked at the relationship between weight gain as well as changes in their 1RM squat and bench and those muscle thickness sites. And we found that when we did what's called a regression analysis, we plotted all the different rates of weight gain from all 3 groups. We had the maintenance group, we had the 5% surplus and the 15% surplus. And because these are humans, kind of the group assignment is less important, but more so the distribution of the various amounts of weight that all these people gained, we were able to plot. And we saw that the strongest relationship was that the more weight someone gained, the more likely they were to put on additional adipose tissue as measured by skin fold thickness. And unfortunately, more weight gain did not equal a higher probability of having a better 1RM on the bench or squat, or greater muscle thickness in the triceps or quads. And there's only a very, very small bit of evidence leaning in towards slightly higher probability of having better bicep thickness. And the big takeaway from that is that well-trained lifters probably can't go back to the well of drinking from the bulking Kool-Aid that they could in their very first, time. Like, especially if you were a relatively skinny or lean person coming into lifting, if you do overfeed and you lift, most people experience a really successful initial bulk.
Right.
And I'm speaking from my own personal experience, but also that as a coach. The next time you go back to that, and the next time, and the next time, each time it's diminishing. And eventually you look up and you're like, I'm really just getting fat. And that's because the closer you get to your genetic ceiling, the slower the rate is going to be for the maximum amount of muscle you can put on any given one time. And at this point, training factors become far more important to focus on, which is probably why we saw that little hint of favorable evidence towards bicep thickness. Because when you look at the actual training protocol, the biceps uniquely had the most volume and the most sets at a close proximity to failure compared to the sets for the triceps, which was all indirect work through bench pressing. The quads was all squatting, but not a super high volume and not to failure. So when you kind of look at that, it's like, oh, it's all indirect pressing work for the triceps, but we've actually got bicep curls and lat pull downs and rows, 18 total sets, all of them to failure because it was the accessories after squat and bench. That kind of lines up with what we see. You increase the stimulus rate, and now you actually have a demand for a little more energy to actually do something. So essentially, the conceptual way to understand this is that when you have more potential to put on muscle at a more rapid rate, you can benefit from a higher surplus. But when you don't, it's going to have to go somewhere, and it's probably going to become adipose tissue. So this means that you should probably scale your surplus to your training age. And if maybe, let's say you are an intermediate, but you've been doing a low volume program for the last 3 years and you're essentially plateaued, and you decide to go, right, I'm going to go from 3 days per week to 5. I'm going to start linearly increasing my volume. I'm going to start training to failure. I'm going to start training with long muscle lengths. I'm going to get a personal trainer. I'm going to start taking creatine. I'm going to do everything right. And you have this late stage spurt, which often does happen. For sure, maybe you could benefit from a 300, 400 calorie surplus. But I would venture a guess that 3-4 months later, you would start to see the proportion of lean mass and the proportion of fat mass start to shift, and you'd want to slow down that surplus. So that's why gaintaining is something that a lot of, especially drug-free, more advanced kind of lifters will talk about. They stop trying to bulk because they just don't see that it's that successful. It doesn't mean that it's never successful. There aren't times to do it, but it just means that you want to make sure that you have a lot of chips stocked up in your favor, and that your training is really on point, and that you're auto-regulating it. Like you're watching your body composition, you're looking in the mirror, you're making sure that the rate of weight gain isn't too fast, and that you're not just seeing vascularity disappear and your 6-pack become a 4 and then a 2 and then a 1-pack really, really fast, or it's just not efficient, right? Yeah.
I think you've given hope to gaintainers everywhere. You're like the Buffy the Vampire Slayer of like bulking, because it's, I've been lifting for almost 30 years now, like 28 years. And I mean, for me, it's more like I don't really want to have a period of not being able to eat enough if I don't have to have it. So in reading your book, you talk about, I want to say like a 4-to-1 ratio of if you had been bulking to like a mini cut. And my logic, which is not scientific, but kind of like the best I can do, is I'm saying, well, wait a second here. That means 2 to 3 months out of the year, I'm kind of potentially in a deficit. But what if I went all year at, based on your study, something that seems pretty valuable, and I can still eat as much? I mean, even if theoretically I'm at 80% of what I could be doing, what if I'm doing that 100% of the time versus not having to take those months? So is that a fair thing to say, kind of in terms of time frames, you could be doing that?
No, I like the way you position that, Charlie, because the funny thing is, like, we can speak to it from the perspective of someone who is relatively fit, relatively lean, and in my case started as like a skinny guy who got into lifting, and also doing so 20 years ago when I started. But I think the reason why I developed that 4-to-1, which also is not science-based, it's kind of something anecdotally derived from my coaching. I don't have any study to cite for that. The reason why I put that 4-to-1 ratio is there is actually the guardrail against people cutting too much. Because it's so common now with the pressure from social media to always be lean, and people always, especially early stage people, now they feel quote unquote skinny fat, which is not a term I love, but I understand the sentiment. Like they want to look muscular, and then when they go into a surplus, when they don't yet have the level of leanness they want, they feel like they're going in the wrong direction always. And when they go into a deficit, when they don't have the level of muscularity they want, they feel like they're just looking smaller and smaller. So they kind of get in this wheel spinning mode, and they try to vacillate too frequently between cutting and bulking. And they don't give themselves a good enough time, especially in the case of leaner people starting lifting, or just smaller people who are not necessarily overly fat starting lifting, to put in the time and really commit to a surplus for a while. Mm-hmm. So by that guardrail of, listen, you got to earn your 1 month mini cut by giving me at least 4 months of bulking. It prevents that behavior from getting out of hand, really.
So it's kind of guardrails again, like you were talking about earlier, only you as a coach are kind of bringing this to your client a little bit.
Yeah, it essentially came from how many times, not even necessarily with my week-to-week clients, but at the time, the people I would consult with kind of on a one-off basis, they'd come to me, they hadn't developed the physique they wanted. I talked to them about their history, and they had gone through like 4 cuts, in the last year, and they really weren't that high in body fat, but also had not really finished their novice stage in terms of the muscle they'd gained, from my estimation as a coach. So, making someone commit to a 4-month bulk, and only getting 1 month to cut, it does 2 things. 1, it prevents the perpetual cutting. But 2, it also prevents them from getting out of hand with the size of the surplus during those 4 months. Because if you're in a huge surplus for 4 months, you can't clean it up in 1 month, right?
Absolutely. I feel like as soon as, because we're those 90s, as soon as you said it, I see like Lee Priest in those ads where I'm like, and they're showing, what was it? It wasn't hydroxycut. I don't know what it even was, but it was just like, you looked at him, enormous, like he just went at it, and then the next picture is like, oh my god, look at the guy. That's really, really interesting that you would do that to rein in, like you said, a client. You as a athlete now, I want to talk a little bit about training and nutrition. For me personally, carbohydrate timing, and going full range of motion, like the deepest stretch possible, which is a big Mike Israell thing, is honestly what informed it the most for me. For you in your training, what was kind of like the game-changing thing for you, where you saw once this thing clicked for you, it kind of changed how you approached your training, if you have something like that?
I have a few, yeah. I think one of the most important things for me was noticing that I needed to do a fair amount more work than some other people to make at least certain muscle groups in my body grow effectively.
Interesting.
So if I was to show you pictures from me in 2011, this was around the time when I started getting a little more into powerlifting and adopting actually a few more training systems that were more strength focused, lower volume, higher intensity. Like I did a West Side kind of approach without a whole lot of accessory work, and training bench, 1 or 2 times a week at most kind of deal. Very effective, and I saw relatively linear growth in my deadlift and my squat and also my lower body. And it might have been that I grew up doing martial arts and I ran the 400 meter in track.
Cool.
But I had, and maybe it's just genetics, like the shape, and if you look at some of my family on both sides, bigger legs are a thing, kind of just naturally without really training. So my lower body seems to respond relatively well to training, and the upper body actually got a little bit smaller from like 2009 to 2011, when I was kind of just more doing bro, higher volume, always to failure bodybuilding versus kind of a power building approach. And I also started doing some of the like Skip LaCour, Jeff Willett, lower volume approaches that were popular in the mid 2000s, where it's like 4 to 6 reps, you train to failure 2 sets.
Is Mike Mentzer in that territory?
Mike Mentzer was like more extreme, but it
Gotcha.
kind of like the same vein, but
Same idea.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of the extreme hit approaches in the drug-free bodybuilding realm, just because I I just don't think it works. But somewhere in the midline, kind of like more like a Dorian Yates or that kind of style, like DC training. So anyway, and I actually saw my upper body size regress a little bit from using some of these approaches. And like actually Max OT is the name of it, the one that Jeff Willett, Skip LaCour, those guys were following. Brad Loomis, one of my colleagues at 3DMJ, was using that for a while as well. And yeah, I trained with Jeff Alberts for a while, and he's very gifted and responds quite well to low doses of training. And we trained HIIT style together, and he kept progressing, and my lower body kept progressing, but my upper body kind of plateaued and maybe even regressed a little bit.
Interesting.
So noticing that I seemed to require more work and then leaning into that, each time I've done that, I've seen these spurts in progress and just the willingness to do a lot at a relatively high efficiency as well. So training at longer muscle lengths, I've been playing with that for 2 to 3 years now, based upon the research that's come out, emphasizing the stretch position, pushing more sets towards failure as well, as we've had more research come out. So, my training is uncomplicated in that I do a lot. I do it at a high intensity, a high frequency, and I make the exercises as hard as and efficient as possible. So I do tend to fall on a higher level of volume than a lot of other people would do, or I'd even recommend. I do think it should be individualized, but there's also some context there. As you become more advanced, the rate of progress that you can make slows down, and you can try to offset this by doing more work. And so long as you can recover from it and you're seeing a benefit, then that can be worthwhile. And that just seems to be something that is working well for me now, with the goal of me getting back on stage next year. I don't think I have to do 20 plus sets per muscle group, but if I want to see measurable changes in a short period of time, I might. So absolutely. It's kind of, I'm trying not to burn the candle at both ends. You have to gauge to what degree are you risking burnout, injury, niggles, or setback, or where the diminishing returns from doing so much volume is just not worth it, and you have to deload too frequently or something like that.
That was my next question for you. I was going to ask you how often such a high volume approach becomes, all right, I need a deload.
It really depends on the individual, and I think people who respond better to higher volumes, to some degree baked into them is also that they recover reasonably well from it. This is a benefit that I've had from being in various different silos of the fitness world, because I've trained with strongmen, I've trained with Olympic weightlifters, I've trained with powerlifters, and I've trained with bodybuilders. And I also know a fair number of CrossFitters as well. And I think if the average kind of siloed, low volume bodybuilder just watched CrossFit Games, their head would explode. Like, some of the beliefs you have, you just can't maintain. Like, you can certainly say that what they're doing is not ideal to get as big as possible. But the idea that, oh man, on leg day, I probably shouldn't mow the lawn or I won't recover. It's like, come on, dude, you're not a fragile crop that is just going to get exploded. Like, there's people doing 2-a-day sessions of a workout you couldn't even fathom doing. And they do it again the next day, So it's, anyway, I guess what I'm saying is that it does need to be individualized. Personally, for me, I've had 3 deloads since I started training in this manner to kick off my off season somewhere around like December, January, and it's September, so I don't think that's anything unreasonable,
I don't think so at all. I think the key here that I'm taking away is this is still trial and error. This is still
Always.
Trial and error. This is scientific, and you're using the data you've collected on yourself in this case, and you didn't read it in a Muscle and Fitness and say, oh, I'm going to do 40 sets a week, which is, clearly different. On the subject of CrossFit, in your publication, Muscle and Strength Pyramid, which you guys should have by now, we talked about it earlier in the show, you do talk about cardio and endurance activities, and kind of mixing them with strength training and where the pitfalls may be. I wanted to get your opinion actually on VO2 max today. It's a really big thing today in the health and wellness scope. And again, it involves kind of like that HIIT training sometimes, which can be so intense. I personally, it doesn't work for me. I know a lot of people love it. I ain't training my legs the same week that I'm doing sprints. I can't do it. Where do you stand on that?
There's such an important interaction between modality, intensity, goal, that a lot of that nuance gets missed in some of the conversations that are out there. So there's a lot of health and wellness and health and fitness content producers who are essentially trying to win the health Olympics, like
I love that.
like they've turned like having a high quality of life and living 3 years longer into like an optimization game. And the irony in that is that what you need to do to optimize and improve health is a very low bar. So like if you look at the current guidelines for healthy Americans, the level of activity that you need to reach is 150 minutes of moderate activity, or half of that if it's all vigorous, like 75 minutes per week. That's really easy to achieve.
That ain't much.
No. And when you look at some of the metadata on at what point do you start to see the highest return on investment, not the maximal outcome, but the point when you start to see rapidly diminishing returns on reducing all-cause mortality when you count it by step count, it's like 8,000 to 9,000 steps, maybe 8,000 to 10,000 steps if we're liberal, like right around 9,000, just under steps. And you start to see the biggest effect size for reducing all-cause mortality. And after that, there might be some incremental gains, but it's not a whole lot. And that's independent of doing exercise on top of that. So most of the people who are promoting like your zone 2, 3, and do this, do X, Y, and Z kind of for health purposes, they actually engage in organized exercise 3 to 6 days per week, and they get a step count that is typically like a 5-digit number. They're like your typical fitness influencer, right? If I want to take off my shirt and turn my phone around, I'd be like, all right, hit the 10,000 steps today, bro. Also got a cardio workout. I resistance train 4 days a week, and I do HIIT on my 3 days off. Just trying to maximize things. Yeah, exactly, right? And the reality is that either one of those things independently would be at and then above saturating that signal. So when you do both, most people who are digging into the weeds are missing the forest for the trees. So personally, for example, I have on my Fitbit, I have a goal of 8,500 steps per day. And on average, I reach that. Like if you were to look at my past year, excluding contest prep because it was higher for fat loss purposes, I'm clocking 9,000, 10,000 steps. So right there, if I stopped resistance training at all, I've gotten the biggest bang for my buck as far as my health and longevity. But on top of that, I'm training currently 6 days a week with weights for a total of 6 to 7 hours a week. So in every stretch of the imagination, I've maximized the goal of health, which is a very low bar. Now, with that said, if your goal is improving cardiorespiratory fitness, absolutely, me lifting weights and walking with my wife to breakfast at a point where I'm not even huffing and puffing, I'm not going to go run a 10K right now. It wouldn't go well for me, right? And if someone does want to do cardiorespiratory training, they need to think about the principle of specificity, and VO2 max now becomes important. The relationship that's been observed between VO2 max and health and longevity, it kind of confuses people, because if there is this relationship, therefore I want to do everything to maximize VO2 max.
Right.
But that's not quite the right way of thinking about it, because this is a correlation, not necessarily directly causational. So other things are going to be related in VO2 max. So if for example, you're going to have that gets skewed by the fact that many people with low VO2 maxes are because of an acute health complication, right? Someone who is suffering from disease, who is bedridden, who is bound to a walker or a wheelchair for whatever reason, they're going to have a low VO2 max, right? Also, people who are more naturally fit and healthy, like if you think about endurance athletes who don't train at all, who are at a high level, like you take your typical person who is a pro cyclist, they probably had a higher VO2 max than the average person can get to with regular endurance training. Much like that dude who played NCAA Division I, football and was a linebacker, looks like he was a bodybuilder when he was just doing calisthenics in high school.
Yeah, how'd they do that? I noticed that too.
They picked the right parents. Exactly.
Can we do that over? Can we get a do-over?
Yeah, I sorry, Mom, I got to tell you something. You are the weakest link, and I need someone else. Yeah. So, like I think people forget that VO2 max is influenced by a lot of other factors, and it is a general correlation. It's kind of like saying, well, higher muscle mass is associated with higher strength. That doesn't mean that the way to get bigger is to train in every way to maximize 1RM, right? And that's something we get as kind of lifters, but it's something that we kind of miss when we're talking about the health-related data.
I love what you said earlier about winning the health awards kind of thing like that, because it does seem like they grab onto this new thing that's maybe trendy and it may have promise to it as well, and then they make it the thing they can package. And one of the things I love about your book, In the Escape of Nutrition, is your book feels like to me, the pyramids, that you can apply different nutritional principles to it. It's not exclusive. But when I see certain diets out there that are exclusive, specifically paleo, keto, don't have fiber, avoid this, avoid that, one of the things that always goes through my head, and I wanted to ask you why you think that this isn't spoken about, is like they didn't have a choice. When they were doing this stuff and they had to eat this way, a certain way, maybe they didn't get as much fiber, maybe they couldn't consume vegetables, or it was all fat in this stuff. That might have been optimal to not die, but they didn't have a choice. Like, I kind of feel like if they could have protein bars in their pocket while they were chasing gazelle, they might have. Is that fair?
Yeah, we do have an obsession and often even a mischaracterization of what are ancestral diets. Like if you were to actually look at some of the research done by true paleontologists about what are the things that we find in the old teeth of humans from thousands of years ago, we're finding barley, we're finding wheat, we're finding grains, and depending upon regionally where they were, just like you said, it's what did they have access to? So while it is academically interesting that the Inuit, who live in certain regions where the most energy dense and available foods they have are primarily animal products, and they consume everything from, say, a seal, and they have a high fat, almost ketogenic diet for a fair amount of the time, and that they can live like that, that's amazing. It speaks to the ability of the human body to adapt and survive. That is not necessarily something that we should therefore use as a dietary prescription in the westernized world in 2024, right?
With the stimulation everywhere.
Yeah.
You know?
I think this essentially comes down to the naturalistic fallacy, which is the idea that the more natural something is, the better it is for you. And the definition of natural is very wishy-washy. It is conditionally applied. You'll get the same person who, I mean, how often do you see some guy who is using a fair amount of anabolic steroids, but now questioning the COVID vaccine, And they're like, I'm willing to take an illegal, bathtub-made injection that I give to myself, but I'm not going to go get, a vaccine.
Is this person also eating a lot of liver? I feel like we're going to be talking about liver next.
There we go, right? So we all know the type of person we're talking about, but they are they won't touch a carbohydrate, after 6 p.m., but they're happy to have whey protein, which is extremely processed, or a green supplement
with the carbs.
Yeah. So it's I think a lot of the times it's really helpful to take a slightly more objective approach to nutrition, but also appreciating the fact that nutrition is not just something we do as fitness, health, or sport enthusiasts, but it's an intrinsic part of being human, which is why everyone has nutrition content, and which is why you really can't have a one-size-fits-all approach, because nutrition or your diet is something intrinsic to your culture, intrinsic to your family, intrinsic to your mental health. Every culture has some form of quote-unquote breaking bread. Religious ceremonies, cultural practices are all tied up into eating. The way that, conflicts are restored often involves a meal. You put any ethnicity in front of the word grandmother, and that's someone who wants to feed you. It's there's a humanness, because we wouldn't survive. It's intrinsic to who we are, that is related to food. So when we try to say stuff like food is fuel, or we need to go back to blank X, Y, and Z, that can get twisted a bit. Like, I think it's great for someone to actually focus on what is truly maybe their ancestral diet, because it's culturally relevant, because it's easier to integrate with what their family's doing.
Right.
And there are probably healthy versions of every ethnic diet that is out there that can work quite well, and that might be a better fit, just considering that. But on the flip side of that, that's why you don't just apply that to everyone at all times in all situations without any kind of critical thinking. So nutrition is a huge minefield, and the reasons why it is are multifaceted, but it's also big business. So that also comes into it.
I think, and then again, going back to your book, the social caveats and the social things around food, and talking about health too. I mean, mental health is important. And if you can't go out and see your friends sometimes because you're freaking out over an extra carbohydrate or something like that, I think the good, better, best in the book falls into that a lot for me, in terms of, I'm going to stay within this caloric range, and wherever it is for the day. And mentally, sometimes you need that as well, right?
Yeah. I think my books are essentially just a whole lot of curated scientific content, and you can find, it's 2019, which is why they're getting updated in 2024, but you can find, for what was at the time the most recent published research and the highest quality evidence to get a consensus on how important is protein timing, what supplements are going to make a difference for strength and hypertrophy, etc. But honestly, ChatGPT could do that for you. The reason I think my books are relatively well popular, and they exceeded the expectations I had when I put them out there, is because they ask the reader to think differently about nutrition and training. They take a hierarchical approach. They put things in order. They suggest that some things are conditionally important, and that you can actually view things in relation to one another as priorities. And that's the exact opposite of what fitness content tells you, even evidence-based fitness content. Because we've now understood that we have to get your attention. I have to say something controversial.
Right.
I'm literally competing for your attention span on social media. So I need you to think, even if it is true and the scientific consensus supports it, that this true thing is the most important thing when it comes to your nutrition or training. Which is why you see some people getting annoyed with how trendy, quote unquote, it seems that people are talking about long muscle lengths. People are like, hey, well, don't forget that other factors are also important. And I'm like, hey, you're going to have to just ease up on this, because anything, true or untrue, can only become popularized using these techniques now in the modern social media environment. Everything is a trend. It's just which trends stick. And we should be focusing our energies in the evidence-based fitness space, not on policing the style and the necessity of the marketing demands of the space we're operating in, but just ensuring that we are actually saying things that are true, and that the messaging isn't completely subverting the approach to thinking you need. And that is my only critique, is that if you make someone think that meal timing or a multivitamin or peri-workout protein intake, even though they do have evidence behind them that they could be beneficial in some cases, are the most important thing, because every video says the thing it's on is the most important thing, so I need to get your attention, that can confuse people. And that's the gap that I stepped into with my books. I was doing these consultations with people who, again, weren't weekly clients, but they were these one-off conversations, and they weren't lacking for knowledge. What they were lacking for was the ability to contextualize and integrate it and understand some type of priority. And they were trying to juggle far too many things and dropping balls, and they were getting the quote-unquote proverbial cart before the horse. They were focusing on the minutia, not understanding that it was minutia, and not spending enough time on the big rocks. So asking people to ask better questions, understand things in relation to one another, and connecting those dots for people so that they could turn facts into knowledge, into practice, is essentially why I think my books are relatively well received by the people who are willing to dig in.
They're fantastic, and they're so readable and approachable, and it doesn't, it just doesn't feel like you're trying to sell someone something that is a fad, and here's this sexy thing. If you just do this, first of all, your book would be 2 pages long if you just do this. It's a lot more than that, but it's, there's such I think I've been flex dieting a long time, and for me, it just fits into that idea where there are times I'm going to be good about it, and there are going to times I'm going to have to pull back a little bit. And as long as I understand these pillars and I'm kind of mindful of my signals, my hunger signals, and all these other things, it's really a special thing. So hats off to you again there.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, is there any health benefit? Is there a healthiest diet phase? Is there any longevity or health benefit to being in a deficit versus maintaining versus excess calories? Does that science exist?
If you are a rat, absolutely, it does. So,
Oh boy.
yeah, the thing is that a lot of there's a persistent conversation around being energy or even protein restricted and the potential benefit for longevity health, and someone will throw around, autophagy or macrophages or mechanisms that are probably, best case scenario, to be generous, they might even be accurate in the way that mechanism operates, but the magnitude of effect and the potential trade-offs they have not necessarily considered. We can use an animal model in a species which only lives a fraction of our life length, and this has also been done in like insects, calorie restrict them and go, oh, wow, look at that, they live longer. But understanding that the equivalent would be asking a human to be in an energy deficit for 30 years,
Ooh.
right? Now, that energy deficit doesn't stay a deficit. You're going to see loss of weight. You're going to be seeing some metabolic adaptation. It's essentially going to be a state of mild low energy availability for 30 years and having a suppressed energy expenditure and suppressed body weight. But then you're living in a constant state of potential malnutrition, worst case scenario, or at the very least being food focused and feeling a little lethargic and being weight restricted and energy restricted and maybe developing some eating issues. And the potential payoff is quite minor when we look at other animal models that are more similar to us, like other primates in captivity, and we look at the actual associations in especially protein intake. They're the inverse of that claim. Like protein restriction enhances lifespan, yeah, maybe in a fruit fly or a rat, but when we look at protein restriction, that's actually associated with increased fall risk and higher mortality and lower quality of life when we talk about elderly humans, right?
Yeah.
So the protein restriction one directly conflicts with the observations we have in the real world. And by the way, a high protein diet is not as high as often the bodybuilder thinks. And we're talking 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kg, and you're doing great. So 0.5, 0.6 grams per pound, not that hard, right? And as far as the energy restriction, you're just looking at something that, a recommendation that essentially doesn't respect all those things we talked about earlier about culture, the societal benefits of eating, and really like it's something that is not that useful. And then people try to get around it by creating these really complex and even further unsubstantiated approaches like, oh, I will do an intermittent fasting period because some fasting study on a rat did this, so I'm just going to skip breakfast. I'm like, okay, that's not the same thing. Right. Or I'm going to have every 5 days I'll take a day off eating on Saturday. It's like, that's again not the same thing, and we don't have data on that. It's a huge leap from animal mechanistic data to something that's not. It wasn't even what we did in the animal, but it's you trying to apply that. So, in theory, yes, energy restriction might lead to slightly higher length of life, but I think in terms of quality of life and the actual application, it's the opposite and pretty much impossible.
And the lifespan, the health span part of me has to count also, right? I would think.
I would think even more so. I think if you put someone in captivity and restricted energy and kept them in a state of low energy availability for 30 years, they might have looked back and traded that for 28 years of enjoying life, so.
I also wanted to ask you kind of on the subject of nutrition, you're kind of in your off season right now, I assume?
Yeah.
What does a day of eating look like for you right now?
Actually, it looks very similar to contest prep qualitatively, but the energy content of the meals is just a little bit shifted. So I eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then I also have either a post-workout shake on days I train or like a protein bar around the same time between lunch and dinner on days I don't train, and then I have a little bit of skyr, which is like Icelandic Greek yogurt, if you will, before bed. And that's pretty much it. and the total energy intake right now, I am trying to get up to about a little over 200 pounds, or around 92 kilos for the metric system folks, because body comp is still looking good, and we kept upshifting what do we think the max off-season weight should be, because I'm making leaner gains than expected. It's a good problem to have.
Are you trying to come in at a heavier weight in terms of when you do cut down?
Always, right? But you don't get the choice, you know?
Well, yeah.
I had, it's funny, as a side comment, I had someone say, Eric, don't you think you'd do better as a heavyweight at 6'4"? And I was like, bro, I don't get to choose. You know, like, you think I've been holding back for the last 20 years? You know?
That's hilarious.
Yeah. So if I was shredded and I was a heavyweight, fantastic. I do think my stage weight will probably be up a bit based upon what we talked about earlier, you know, like making a spurt of progress as an advanced lifter. And a big reason for that is, for the last 19 years, I have been equal measure strength athlete and physique athlete. You know, to date, I have done 17 shows, but I've done 20 powerlifting meets, bouts, a handful of weightlifting meets, 2 strongman competitions, and a Highland Games competition. So my very first competitive endeavor in fitness was actually a push-pull unsanctioned powerlifting meet at the YMCA, my first personal training job. And I have always trained in equal measures for both. So I've had to balance being a strength athlete and a physique athlete. And after turning pro in 2023, I was like very, very motivated by that. And I went, you know what, I'm only going to train for bodybuilding and really give myself the best shot at maximizing my potential. And kind of reducing the toll that strength training takes on my body, and really just putting all my chips in for the singular goal of maximizing hypertrophy, I think at this stage of my development was an important kind of, I wouldn't say barrier, but logistical challenge that now is easier. I can be more efficient, and I'm able, like, I couldn't do the kind of volumes I'm doing now while also powerlifting.
Yeah.
Be able to recover.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
That absolutely makes
anyway,
sense.
I've seen some really good gains, probably kind of, I wouldn't say newbie gains, but certainly like a reinvigoration of being like an early stage intermediate. And I do think, and so does, say, Brian Miner and Alberto Nunez, who are kind of like my in-season and off-season coaches and colleagues from 3DMJ. They're anticipating I'll be up anywhere from maybe like 1 to 5 pounds in stage weight, which is pretty cool at this stage of the game. So
What kind of a surplus are you using based on what we were talking about earlier? How are you applying that?
Probably like 100 to 200 calories. Not a huge amount.
And you're a big guy.
Yeah. So
that's kind of tying into your study and your research. I mean, if you're making that kind, and you're saying body comp looks good.
Yeah.
You know that.
It's exactly. It's gaintaining is probably the way I would look at it. You know, I have gone from I've gone from, I think I finished my season like carved up just under 80 kilos. I was around like 79 or about 175 pounds. And right now I'm just starting to hit 200 pounds, and it's been, my season ended in November 2023 and it's September. So there was kind of like a logarithmic change in body weight, because there's no reason for me to be that light. Like, I don't want to creep up to 83. So I very quickly, got to 83, 84, and then there was kind of a moderate pace, and now it's a slower pace. So as again, what we think is, for one, actually wanted to put on body fat relatively rapidly, regain any lost lean mass, and then we instituted a lot of these novel changes. So I saw faster rates of muscle gain, say 3-4 kilos ago, and now it's starting to taper off. So we're also tapering off the rate of weight gain. Because if I was to see like a kilo gain in the next 3 weeks right now, it would probably be mostly body fat. But I did see a kilo of gain, say 3 weeks sometime in like February, and it was mostly muscle, because I was doing all these new things and I was just recovering coming out of competition season. So I think that context is important. Those 25 pounds that I've put on since November, there was a relatively fast 6, a reasonably slow 10, and now this last 9 has been like pretty slow pace.
What is the next competition, or at least the next time of competing that you kind of have? I know it can change, and you have to look at all those factors. But what are you kind of aiming to do?
Yeah, so my plan is to find a pathway back to WNBF Worlds 2025, which is in November, and then to compete there I have to do another show as a pro prior to that to qualify. And I plan to do a couple just to give myself some multiple good shots. So my plan is to start competing in October. So there is a really cool show that is a Pro-Am that just came out in WNBF Taiwan that's held in Taipei. It's one of the biggest shows, if not the biggest show in the WNBF. I think this year I'll be judging at it. I'm going to be going to Taiwan to judge. It's a really cool opportunity. Big shout out to Eason Liu and the WNBF Taiwan team. But they have nearly 400 competitors in the show, which is humongous. As far as
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's huge. So that's really cool. And I want to say there's almost 40 pros competing in it. So like 10% of those athletes to Pro-Am are pros, and that's big. You know, that's close to the number of pro men bodybuilders that were at Worlds. You know, granted this is across weight classes, so it's a big pro show. It's not like the biggest, but it's a pretty big pro show. So that I would like to do next year as my season opener, and then there's another show that is in California, kind of in my stomping grounds, where I've competed multiple times, the Muscle Mayhem, which is a Pro-Am, and that'll be just, I think, 3 weeks before Worlds. So my plan is to do...
I might have to get there for that.
That'd be cool.
That I might have to get there for, because that would be really fun. And I need to show my kids, like my young guys too. He's always like, "Daddy, muscles." So if that could be the first experience, like seeing bodybuilding, that'd be kind of neat. I'd like that.
That'll be great. It'll be in early November in the Sacramento greater area, and the plan right now is for the entire 3DMJ coaching staff to compete in 2025.
Wow.
So we'll probably all be doing that show. Jeff, Berto, myself, Brian, and Brad. So
I love that you guys function so much as a team too, with whatever you guys are doing. It's very, very nice to see that.
Those guys are my brothers. It's awesome. Yeah,
I love it. And the podcast too. I know you do mostly with Omar, the Iron Culture, but Eric Trexler's been on it too. Am I correct?
Yeah. So Iron Culture for about a year now, if not a little bit longer, has been the triumvirate. Trexler officially as a host. And the Iron Culture podcast is started in 2018, late 2018. The 3DMJ podcast, I want to say, actually started in 2015. And because that includes some of our specialists, it includes Andrea, who is our head of content, and it includes all the coaches. I'm on maybe 60% of the episodes, and that's an every other week podcast, although it did used to be more frequent. So yeah, both podcasts are approaching like episode 300. So
that's amazing. I love it. The last thing I wanted to touch on with you, because we're talking a lot about fat loss phases and dieting, and you're in such a unique place where you're professionally doing this and going to these different levels of body fat, and you're also coaching people, you know, and you have the scientific background. I wanted to get your opinion on the Ozempic, the Monjouro, the GLP-1 agonists that we see today, and I just want to know your thoughts on them. I know people that I love who I think might benefit from them. I've read what I can on them from my place, which is not scientific necessarily. What are your thoughts?
Sure. And first, let me just apologize. I never answered your earlier question, but I am planning to start my diet in March to compete in those shows. So I've got
awesome.
6 months of off-season left. So the first caveat is that these are only tangentially in my area of expertise as they relate to body composition change, but I am by no means an expert on their pharmacology, nor do I have any experience with them. I haven't had any clients, friends, or family who have taken them, and I'm a PhD, not an MD, so I can't prescribe them. So there are some really good people with good perspectives on this in this space, like Barbell Medicine. Those guys are MDs. Spencer Nadolski, he's an obesity doctor who also does a lot of evidence-based content. Those would both be places I would look if I was to try to get someone's opinion. But what I can say, just from looking at the research and being reasonably well-educated enough in the space of academia to read that, is that they've got really good data on them. They are the most efficacious weight loss regimen we have when we compare lifestyle changes and even bariatric surgery, and they have lower complications and lower rates of side effects they typically result in more than 10% weight loss that is sustained as long as the person takes it over the course of 1 to 2 years. They also have some really interesting side effects where they seem to increase self-efficacy and the likelihood of people sticking to diets and exercise, because many people who are pursuing diet and exercise to see weight loss, when they fail, it erodes their self-efficacy. And some of the reasons for why people do struggle to stick to those things is that they have a dysregulated hunger and satiety relationship with food. That is one of the etiological factors that for some people with certain types of obesity does seem to lead towards it being this kind of white-knuckling, constant struggle to maintain restraint, and why we see relatively low rates of success through diet and exercise interventions for long-term weight loss maintenance. You know, the barrier for what do we consider successful long-term weight loss maintenance is losing at least 5% of your body weight and keeping it off for more than a year. And when we look at the best outcome interventions, where you have master's degree level clinicians using the most up-to-date and comprehensive ways of supporting people get enrolled into a trial and they're getting acceptance-based therapy, they're getting a personal trainer, they're getting a nutritionist, they're meeting regularly in support groups, and they're getting guided psychotherapy in addition to guided nutrition and exercise training. Now we're looking at about 50% of people who achieve that, right? And that's not good, you know, like, and that's kind of like as good as it can get on the health and nutrition side of things.
Right.
So when you look at something where the majority of people are doubling that in terms of not only the weight loss, but the weight loss maintenance retention, it is a total game changer.
It's incredible.
I think people do in the health and fitness space struggle with it because I don't think they would admit it, but it feels like cheating to them, you know? And I think if you're truly interested in supporting people, we just care, is it safe? Is it accessible? Is it worth it? And does it help them achieve their goals? And especially when I see some of these health and fitness influencers who are like clearly on anabolic steroids and they have a problem with someone else taking Ozempic, I'm like, can't get the fuck out of here, you know? So
no, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. So personally for me, I think under the guidance of a doctor, not just taken for, you know, off script or anything like that, for the right people, it can be very important. And it does seem to have, you know, important health benefits, especially for people with metabolic disease, type 2 diabetes. And, you know, there are obviously new classes of the drug, you know, oral versus injectable. There are considerations with the fact that you were going to end up being in a relatively large calorie deficit, so you probably do need some counseling to ensure that you have appropriate nutrition and you have good habits. I think if someone doesn't get any health and lifestyle counseling and then just finds themselves chronically far less hungry, they might just eat a less of low quality foods, which is I guess it's better than being in a surplus while eating low nutrient density foods, but it's certainly not the best option.
To your point as well, if, you know, I guess the only thing that kind of comes to my mind in terms of concern is, what if they can't get their hands on these things for whatever reason?
Absolutely.
And now, like you said, they haven't made those lifestyle and behavior changes. That could be dangerous, because I've just been having a quarter of a Big Mac for the last, you know, and I'm not saying, I think most people who are taking those drugs are taking them with the intention to better themselves. I don't think they're going to the drive-through. But it does pose the question, you know, what is that like if they can't get that drug?
Yeah. And those are societal level questions that are, you know, beyond my expertise and also beyond my agency to influence, you know, sometimes, you know, there's even debates among doctors, like hypotheticals, like, hey, should we put low dose statins in the water? You know, considering the amount of like cardiovascular disease deaths there are. And
would they tell us first?
I mean, you'd hope, right? You know, but I mean, like, if you think about it, like, all right, what's the risk of low dose statins? And obviously if someone drinks a lot of water, they're going to get more, but, you know, like fluoride in the water was a beneficial, successful, you know, thing that has clear, you know, positives for dental health, and is a thing that's included in the Western world. Or fortifying white bread after, you know, in the 40s, like things like this are intriguing questions, and I don't necessarily have the answers, but I think it's funny that, like, if you if you could wave a magic wand, put everyone in the world on a low-dose statin, there'd be a lot of people who are medicated for no reason, but it probably wouldn't have an impact on them. And it might reduce the number of deaths that occur annually in the millions, like
it's very interesting.
Yeah.
That is really an interesting point of view. I mean, that's kind of like Magneto was right or something like that. I mean, it's kind of one of those things where you're, like, is it wrong? I mean, it sounds actually.
Well, I also believe in autonomy, consent, and a democratic society where we have choice. So
but if they're telling people, like, hey, if you're drinking from this fountain, just so you know, this isn't going to be an issue.
You want the Ozempic and statin and fluoride-free fountain that's over there, right?
This is like all the Poland Spring bottle companies, like the stocks are through the roof tomorrow. They all see this.
Exactly. But I guess my point is that it's much easier for me to tell someone, here's the data on something, here's when it should be used, here's what I know about it, here's what I don't know, and here are the concerns. But if we were to go, will it be available? Will it be affordable? What happens if I don't get it? Those are things that are unfortunately based upon decisions that or outcomes that occur in society that we don't really have a whole lot of agency over. What's the healthcare system in your country? For what insurance companies and billability will be able to impact that. Is there a shortage? Can you even get the FaceTime with your doctor to get the type of screening you need to get there? And how many different referrals will you need before 6 months from now you get told, yes, you can have it, we don't have any available. So it's, I think those things are more important, frankly, than the conversation that we're having about it, but they're also things that we have less agency over and are even more outside of my expertise.
It's unbelievable. Dr. Eric Helms, you are fantastic. Please check out 3DMJ, guys. Subscribe to them. Iron Culture, subscribe. These books, The Muscle and Strength Pyramids, I can't get them. I can't read them enough. I'm going to get some links for them out there too. Subscribe to Mass if you want to try to learn these things the best you can like I do. Eric, thank you so much for being here. This has been a fantastic conversation. I hope you will come talk to me again.
Anytime you want, brother.
That sounds fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Pleasure.
And good morning in New Zealand as I'm losing light here.
That's right. And good evening to you.
I'm like, is it my bedtime yet? I need to take my statins and get to sleep.
There you go.